Hello, everybody. So you wanted me to read again. So it is chapter 11 that we're going to be on in October Sky today. And we are going to read the chapter called Rocket Fuel. So we are on page 185. On Saturday morning, I began stringing extension cords from the basement up the steps and out into the backyard and over the fence and into the back alley to the other side of the garage where there was an old picnic table. Odell had assembled protective shields for us, baseball caps with squares of clear plastic, rescued out of some garbage can, taped to the bills so they hung down in front of our faces. I put on an old Navy pea coat. It had belonged to my Uncle Joe when he was in the Navy during World War II, and winter gloves. The hot plate and pot were one of Mom's kitchen cabinets. I didn't figure she had missed them before I put them back. That's a little bit of foreshadowing for you. The hot plate glowed a bright orange. The other boy stood back as I sprinkled saltpeter into the pot. I prayed it wouldn't blow up in my face. A few drops of liquid formed and then boiled off. Encouraged, I took a tablespoon of saltpeter and dumped it in, and then stirred the pot with a wooden spoon also borrowed from the kitchen. A clear puddle of liquid formed, and Odell, also wearing a ball cap shield, coat, and gloves, poured in some more until there was an inch of liquid steaming in the bottom of the dry pot. Now the sugar, I croaked. Fear made my throat dry. So remember, guys, the reason they're doing this is they figured out in the last chapter that it's going to work better if they try to melt it first, but they have to be really careful because of, it being a powerful chemical they're dealing with, and they don't want it to blow up. So we are on 186. Odell leaned back at an acute angle and shoveled a little sugar in. Nothing happened except the granules immediately dissolved, and a sweet smell, not unlike vanilla fudge, began to wisp up from the pot. Encouraged, he poured more sugar in. I kept stirring until the mix turned viscous and milky. I'll be God darned, Roy Lee breathed in relief. It didn't blow up. Don't cuss, I scolded, sweat trickling into my eyes. Pray. Sherman put on his cap shield and put an inverted auk casement on the table. We need a funnel, he said. Roy Lee was rummaging through the cupboard in the kitchen when my mother found him. Hi, Miss Hickam, he said, grinning sheepishly. Sonny needs a funnel. She eyed him suspiciously. The only one I know of is the one in the garage that his dad uses to change oil in the Buick. What does he want it for? Then she looked past him to the extension cords. What are you boys up to now? Melting rocket fuel. Mom held the funnel as she came around the garage. Smells like fudge, she said when she caught a whiff of the mix. At her appearance, we all froze. Well, go ahead, she sighed. Do what you're going to do. Can't you just hear her saying, but don't blow yourself up? Roy Lee gently took the funnel from Mom's hand and inserted it into the oak casement. I lifted the pot and tipped it carefully, the rock candy pouring out, but it hung up in the funnel, backing up and almost overflowing. Mom hurried into the garage, coming back with a long straw torn from an old broom. Here, she said, jabbing at the mixture in the funnel. We're at the top of 187. Mom, I protested, and Roy Lee tugged her arm back. If the stuff caught fire, she didn't even have one of our pitiful little shields. Roy Lee moved Mom back to the garage, and Odell took over the straw jabbing. It worked, and the slurry began to flow into the casement. A glass rod would be better, Sherman said, for future reference. The casement was only half full, so I put the pot back on the hot plate to mix up some more. That was a mistake. A thin layer of melted mix had dried on the bottom of the pan. With a whoosh, the stuff erupted. Whoa, we all fell back. The pot went flying. A puff of vaporous spume rose from the back alley like an Indian smoke signal. So that's a simile right there. But you might want to make a note there that the rocket fuel that they heated up in the pot exploded. A group of men going to work stopped to watch. Hey, Elsie, one of them called. You teaching those boys how to cook? Guffawing, several of them strolled in closer, carrying their lunch buckets, their helmets set back on their heads, pants tucked in, hard-toe boots. I recognized them as the crew of men out of Anawalt that Dad had brought in for a one-time job, the demolition of a particularly stubborn slab of rock in a new part of the mine. They were sharing a house up in the New Camp part of town. "You boys are stupid, ain't you?" one of them said, his big jaw shifting in his cheeks. Mom's eyes narrowed. "Get on to work. These boys aren't stupid. They're scientists. I said get." Look at Mom defending her boys. The men trudged on laughing, and we were left alone with Mom. Every muscle in my body said run, and the other boys seemed halfway to trot already, although they were actually quite still. Mom picked up her blackened pot and contemplated it. "I think if you wash the pot, after you mix this stuff, it won't explode." She tapped our plastic face shields, tugged at our coats, inspected our gloves. I started to explain everything, but she held up her hand. "Move that table farther from the garage. You wouldn't want to burn up your dad's Buick." She looked at me. "You'll buy me a new pot." I think it's cool that his mom is just so cool about everything. She's so supportive. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at us one by one. "I'm getting tired of saying this. Don't blow yourself up." That's funny. Well, we'll write everything down like a recipe, I said, trying to assure her. "Wash the pot, clean up everything before we melt another batch." "For sure, yes, ma'am," the others mumbled, shifting back and forth on their feet. They still weren't sure they were going to get out of this without big trouble from Mom. "Will this make our rockets fly better?" she asked. We looked at one another. We were scared truthful. "Maybe," was all I could say. Late one evening, when usually he was dozing in his easy chair in front of the television set, my father opened the door of my room and walked inside. He caught me idling, doodling the design of a rocket that could fly to the moon. My homework, a stack of it, awaited. "I hear from your mother that you're thinking about being an engineer," he said. "I guess I don't know what an engineer does," I said. "All I know is I want to work on rockets," I added, just in case we are having an argument that wasn't apparent yet. "There's a lot more to engineering than rockets," he said gruffly. He smoothed his voice as if catching himself. He picked up my drawing and looked it over. "If you're thinking about being an engineer, you need to see what one does for a living." He put the drawing back on my desk and looked around my room. One of the first times I think he had ever done that. I had a couple of alt casements on my dresser, which he stared at for a moment. "All this rocket stuff they're doing down at Cape Canaveral," he said, "is just burning up taxpayers' money to scare the Russians. A real engineer builds his things to make money for his company." "Yes, sir." I thought by agreeing with him, maybe he'd go away. "I'm going to show you firsthand what an engineer does," he said. Then he told me his plan. It was the most remarkable thing. I just gaped at him. "Are you sure?" I puffed up a bit. This was something he had never asked Jim to do. "I'm sure," he said. "It's about time you see what this town's all about." Basil was at the next launch with his notebook pad, writing furiously. The response from his articles had been so great, he had decided to make us a regular feature. Watching us were about 50 spectators. Attracted by his articles and our notices, I hoped we wouldn't disappoint them. Auk 12 on the pad was built to the design we had more or less standardized. But how it would perform loaded with melted rocket candy was a complete unknown. I feared an explosion, and Quentin was certain of it. "It'll take at least 3 rockets loaded in this manner," he predicted, "before we get the right combination." Sherman went over to the road to make sure people knew they needed to stay back, and it would be the best if they got behind their cars and trucks. Buck and some of the football team showed up too. They stood apart, quietly sullen. Except for the football boys, our audience was festive. "Go, Big Creek," some people called out, just as if we were the football team. Then we ran up our BCMA flag. They began to sing the school fight song. On, green and white, we are right for the fight tonight. Hold that ball and hit that line. Every Big Creek star will shine. I had never known what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that song. I liked it. A football boy yelled something derisive, but the people kept singing. Afterwards, some young ladies chanted like cheerleaders. "Go, Rocket Boys, go!" Disgusted, Buck and the other team members got into their cars and left. This was also our first launch with an electrical ignition system. I touched a wire to a car battery, an old one Odell got free from a war junkyard. And Auk 12, my dog, An OC-12 shot off the pad and leaned down range. Quentin ran outside the bunker and fumbled with a new invention he called a theodolite. It was a broomstick with an upside-down protractor attached on one end and a wooden straight edge on the opposing side that rotated around a nail. So you need to mark that about the theodolite. And I would also mark that the football boys were at the launch of their OC-12, but they ended up leaving because they were jealous of the fact that the Rocket boys were getting so much attention. Now the cheerleaders are cheering for them instead of the football boys. So mark what the theodolite is. He jammed the stick in the slack and went down on his knees and squinted along the straight edge at the rising rocket, smoke squirming from its tail, white against the brilliant blue of the cloudless sky. At the height of the Ox climb, Quentin looked at the angle the ruler made with the protractor and called it out, then snatched a pencil stuck behind his ear and wrote it down on a scrap of paper. If his theodolite worked, trigonometry would give us the altitude of our rocket. So just make notice that that's what the theodolite's for. It's to give them the altitude of their rocket. OC-12's exhaust trail was still a fast stream when the rocket faltered and began to fall. It continued to smoke vigorously even after it struck the slack. While our audience cheered, we ran after our rocket and watched the last of its sputtering rocket candy burn up. I immediately saw the reason our rocket had lost its thrust. The nozzle's gone, I told the others. It must have blown out. We're on 191. We looked closer. The weld was intact. The center of the nozzle was simply eaten away. Quentin came stepping up to us. 348, he said, finishing his count by bringing both his fingers together at the final step. I'm figuring about 2.75 feet per step. That would be, he made a quick mental calculation, 957 feet. Jake's trig book was under his arm. He ran his finger down the functions in the back. Let's see. The tangent of 40 degrees is about 0.84. Call it 0.8. Multiply that by 960. OC-12 went 760 feet. So mark that. We waited anxiously while Quentin worked it out in his head. It didn't take long. 760 feet. Odell whooped and did a little jig on the slack. OC-13 jumped from the pad in a similar blurred frenzy to its predecessor. Rock candy was definitely hot stuff. The rocket leaned over, puffed a big cloud of smoke, and sped off into the sky. When it fell back, it disappeared into a dense thicket of trees. We heard it hit branches as it fell. A big oak tree waving its golden leaves at us as if signaling, "Come and get it, rocket over here." Odell knocked over Quentin's theodolite in his excitement, so we didn't get an altitude estimate, but it was obvious it hadn't gone as high as OC-12. When we found the rocket, the nozzle was completely worn, though. Maybe it just can't take the heat, Billy said. I studied the nozzle. You know what? It looks to me like it's corroded, I said. Rapid oxidation, Quentin said, snapping his fingers. Sonny, my boy, how quick you are. Of course, I should have seen it myself, just like in Miss Riley's class. Heat combined with a steady flow of excessive oxygen. So mark that. Mark that their rocket showed rapid oxidation, and that is heat combined with a steady flow of excessive oxygen. It makes sense. What we need, gentlemen, is a material capable of withstanding heat and oxidation. 192. When we came down off the mountain with our rocket, all the observers were gone, but Buck and the football team were back. They were at our blockhouse, tearing it apart board by board using tire irons. Mark that, guys. We roared and ran at them. "Come on, little sister morons," Buck screamed, red in his face. We were no match for them, but we had to do something. I picked up a rock, and the other boys did the same. We let loose a barrage, missing for the most part, but making them dodge. They charged us, and we knew we were doomed. Then we heard a car horn, and Tag Farmer, remember the constable, drove his old Mercury out on the slack. While we, football boys and rocket boys, all froze in place, Tag leisurely got out and pushed his constable's cap to the back of his head. "So what's going on, boys?" he drawled. Nothing, I said. I was about to turn Buck in. Boys in Coalwood just didn't do that. We were just cleaning up the range. Tag nodded toward Buck and the others, still standing with their fists balled and tire irons in their hands. They helping you? Yes, sir. Tag strolled over to the blockhouse, musing over the planks that had been ripped out. Buck, he called softly. Buck meekly went to the constable. Yes, sir. You a carpenter? No, sir. It might be time to learn. Looks like some boards came loose on this blockhouse. Yes, sir. You going to take care of this? Yes, sir. Tag nodded. Buck stooped and picked up the boards. I came over and handed him a hammer from the tool chest we always carried with us, and he got busy. Tag chuckled and stayed around until everybody left. So, I'm sure Sonny and them were just kind of afraid to tell on Buck, so they kind of saved their tails that night. On Sunday morning, I pretended to oversleep, part of Dad's plan to avoid trouble, and Mom flung open the door to my room. Get up or you're going to miss Sunday school. I was about to fib to her, but I decided it was okay since it was for her good. I'm pretty worn out, doing so much homework and all. Would you mind if I skipped today, just this once? She turned and went off out of the room. If you want to be a heathen, who am I to stop you? She went bawling after Jim to get out of the bathroom and drive her to church. He answered back that he had only been in there for a couple of minutes. I figured it had been at least an hour. After Jim and Mom left for church, I walked up the path to the tipple where Dad waited for me. I was almost shaking with excitement. I'd lived in Coalwood my whole life, but had never been where Dad was going to take me. I was going in the mine, and the fact that he had asked me, not Jim, had grown even more important through the week whenever I thought about it. So it's not necessarily that he loves the mine, but he's just excited to get to go to a place that his dad's never taken Jim to. Something he can say he's done with his dad. He eyed me carefully when I came into his office. You didn't say a word about this to your mother, did you? No, sir. I said it loud and proud. Right. Well, we'll get you washed up afterward, and she won't even know the difference. That part of Dad's plan I had my doubts about, but I happily went along with it. He knew Mom better than I did, after all. Come over here, he beckoned, spreading a map of his mind on a table. He pointed at a winding black streak that came across it. That's the number 4 Pocahontas seam, the finest and purest coal in the world. These lines I've drawn represent the tunnels we've driven through it since the mine has been operational. He opened a drawer and brought out another drawing. This is the side view of a typical seam. The coal is overlaid by hard shell called draw rock. Underneath is what we call jack rock. Engineers have to know how to hold up the draw rock to keep it from falling and how to move the jack rock out of the way. Doing the engineering in a mine takes a lot of experience and careful calculations. Heavens to Betsy. Dad continued while searching my eyes. I think he was looking for a glimmer of understanding. Excuse me? Lady, I'm tired of this. You're interrupting my book reading every single time. Hey guys, this isn't the first time this has happened, is it? Dad continued while searching my eyes. I think he was looking for a glimmer of understanding. Men who work under those roofs depend on the mining engineers to do it right the first time. It's not like your rocket men, those crazy German scientists, just throwing something up to see if it will work. I resisted the urge to answer that charge, and Dad lectured on. The coal company used the block system, he said, each block being 75 feet by 90 feet. Entries were driven through them in sets of 4. After that, the blocks were taken out by continuous mining machines, one by one, until each of them was only about 15 feet square. Those remaining blocks were called pillars, which were also eventually mined. During all of it, roof bolts and posts and cribs all had to be calculated and set to hold the roof up. Then Dad went off into his favorite subject, ventilating air through the mine. If the air stops circulating, methane will seep out of the coal and build up, Dad said. One spark and the whole mine could explode. To keep that from happening, we use a pressure system. Fans raise the pressure in the mine to a little greater than the surface pressure. The methane is blown out through the vents. You designed that, I asked. I did a good portion of it, he answered, glancing down at his drawings. I was confused on this point. So you're an engineer? He toyed with a slide rule. No, an engineer has a degree. I decided to use some of Mr. Hartsfield's deductive reasoning. Jake Mosby's an engineer, I said. That's right. You know a lot more about coal mining than he does. That's true. I shrugged. Then you're an engineer, right? Dad shook his head. Sonny, you have to have a diploma from a college to be an engineer. I don't have one. That means I can never be an engineer. He looked at me speculatively. But you could. Not knowing what to say, I didn't reply, but kept studying the drawings. This is interesting, I said, and I meant it. So at this moment, you can just really kind of tell that Sonny's proud of his dad. He knows his dad is smart, and it just goes to show, even though, in today's world, you pretty much have to have a degree to get a good job. It does not measure your intelligence, whether you have a degree or not. And in these time periods, guys, a lot of times people just went to work for a company and they moved up with the company and worked and retired from a company. A lot of times ended up leaving with retirement and benefits and everything. So you just had a different kind of loyalty to a company, that people could move up to the highest positions and not have to have degrees. But things have just changed in today's world. Not knowing what to say, I didn't reply, but kept studying the drawings. This is interesting, I said, and I meant it. Dad led me to the bathhouse and opened his locker and handed me a one-piece coverall, hard-toe boots, a white foreman's helmet, and a leather utility belt. When I joined him at the man hoist, he showed me how to clip a lamp battery pack onto my belt and the lamp on my helmet. With the lamp attached, the helmet felt heavy. I moved it around until it felt comfortable. He appraised me and readjusted the helmet, then my belt, until the buckle was squared in the front and the battery hung exactly off my right hip. I felt like a soldier under inspection. Now you look like a mine foreman, he said, after another critical assessment. Let's go. The attendant swung the gate aside, and for the first time in my life, I stepped into the wooden plank platform of the lift. I thought of all the times when I was a small child and had watched the miners descend into the darkness. Now it was my turn. I could feel my heart speed up. The boards in the floor were set apart enough that I could see between them. There was nothing beneath us but a dark chasm. I had a momentary twinge of fear that we were going to fall. The bell rang 3 times, announcing that we were about to be let down. I took a deep, ragged breath. The man hoist winch began to creak and the lift dropped quickly, my stomach lifting up around my throat. I grabbed Dad's arm, then quickly let go in embarrassment. He said nothing, and I watched the solid rock of the shaft slip past. Men had hand-dug the shaft, but I couldn't imagine how. It had taken me and the boys all day just to dig out a little place for our blockhouse at Camp Colwood. Through the gaps in the floor, I started to see lights far below. Above us, the square of light at the top of the shaft had shrunk to a tiny twinkling star. We were being swallowed by the earth. That's personification, by the way, because the earth doesn't really swallow you like a human. And I hadn't decided yet whether I liked that. I remembered the tag had frozen at the bottom of the shaft, refusing to get off the lift. Now I understood his fear very well. When we neared the bottom, the lift slowed, jerked a few times, and then settled level with the rock platform. I switched on my helmet light. There were miners waiting on the platform. Mr. Dumanet was among them. He looked at me with surprise. A new hire, Homer? He'll need to join the union. Sonny's thinking about becoming a mining engineer, Dad snapped. A company man. Well, Mr. Dumanet replied with a noticeable lack of enthusiasm. Now, wouldn't that be something? Solid gray walls surrounded us. I felt almost as if I were on some alien planet. All the things I'd ever known that oriented me. Trees, the sky, the mountains, none of them was around. The air even smelled different, like wet gunpowder. Off to the right was a set of tracks with a big, yellow electric locomotive sitting on it. Some cars behind. I could see a connecting tunnel to the left, the blue haze of fluorescent light showing through the window in a concrete block building. Hot white flashes and rapid hisses within indicated arc welding. Dad saw me looking. We put a little machine shop down here. Save some time bringing out equipment that needs repair. Is Mr. Bykovsky in there, I wondered? Dad rocked on his hard-toed boots. Ike's not a machinist anymore, Sonny. He's a loader and a dang good one. He stepped forward. "Come on, let's get on down the line." Dad led me to the locomotive, stopping to talk to its operator. I recognized him. That was Mr. Weaver, whose son Harry was 5 grades ahead of me. Harry had gone in the Marine Corps, had landed in Lebanon, and when President Eisenhower had decided to help out over there. Mr. Weaver sat on the front with a lever to control the power to the locomotive's electric motors. "Hey, Sonny," he greeted. "Hey, sir. Take us all the way to the face, Frank," Dad said. "You've got it." Dad took me to an attached car he called a man trip. It was a low-slung steel car with 2 hard metal benches inside that faced each other. We crawled inside the man trip and sat side by side facing forward. Dad slapped the top to the left to let Mr. Weaver know we were ready to go. The man trip lurched and we were off, plunging down what seemed an endless black tunnel. Dad said we were on the main line. For 20 minutes the rails clacked beneath us, the pots holding up the rock, roof blurring past like a subterranean forest of gray tree trunks. On straightaways, the locomotive roared as we flew down the track, the man trip rattling and shaking. We were at the top of 198. I could smell the hot odor of the locomotive's electric motor. Before we got to a curve, Mr. Weaver applied the brakes, and the steel wheels of the locomotive and our man trip squealed like 1,000 tortured pigs. That's a simile. I held the steel seat with my hands between my legs so I wouldn't fall over when we took the curves. As we sped along, I occasionally saw the flash of miners' lamps down branching tunnels, but it was too dark to see what they were doing. At my question about them, Dad said they were dusting, spreading rock dust around to hold down the explosive mixture of coal dust and air. It registered on me after a time that the mine was not the cold, dank, ugly place I'd always imagined it to be. The air was cool and dry, and when we stopped at a switch to let a line of low coal cars go past us, I peered down the tunnel, and the mica in the rock wall sparkled like diamonds. I remembered then that Dad had once brought home some mica crystals with him and left them on the kitchen table for Mom, along with a card that said, "You always wanted diamonds, but these are the best I can do. I wish they were real." The next morning, waiting for him on the table, was Mom's note of reply. "I never wanted diamonds. I only wanted a little of your time. That's all I still want." But she didn't throw Dad's diamonds away. I knew. I had come across them and the notes while looking for some writing paper in her desk. That's really special. I would mark that Michael looks like diamonds, and then his dad had given his mom some for a gift with that note, saying he wished they were diamonds. And I think that's sweet that she replied that she didn't want him, that she just wanted him. When the man trip stopped, Dad jumped out. "We've got an operation going at the face today," he said. "I want you to see it." When I climbed out, I stood up and slammed my helmet into the roof so hard it almost knocked me to my knees. I staggered, then looked up to see what I had hit and saw slabs of rock, roof bolts jammed into them every few feet. Dad ignored my trouble and took off at a fast pace, never looking back. I took off after him, my helmet whapping against the roof in painful staccato. Every time I thought I had found a rhythm to my walk, I hit my head again. Once I hit a header so hard it knocked me off my feet. I landed on my back, my helmet flying, saved only by the lamp cord attached to the battery on my belt. I scrambled after it. By the time I got my helmet back on, Dad had disappeared around a turn. I could see the jumping reflections of his lamp on a far wall. I hurried after him, my helmet still knocking against the roof. I was developing a powerful crick in my neck. Pretty soon he was so far ahead of me I knew I would never catch up. I was so close to panic. What if I got lost? If my lamp went out, nobody would ever find me again. Then I heard a noise like the mine was tearing itself apart. I felt like running away, but where would I go? I turned a corner and I beheld an astonishingly huge machine, spotlights bolted to its side, tearing at a wall of coal. Dad was off at the side watching it. He saw me and waved me over. "That's a continuous mining machine," he yelled over its roar. It looked to me more like some kind of great prehistoric animal. Dad positioned me out of the way when a shuttle car darted in, its crab-like arms sweeping up the coal thrown out behind the continuous miner. When the shuttle was full, it backed off, dragging a thick electrical umbilical behind it. I realized this was the kind of vehicle Mr. Bykowski had been assigned to. I looked closer to see if it was him, but the operator was Mr. Kirk, the father of Wanda. a girl in the class behind mine. Wanda had a great voice and sang in the school choir. Mr. Kirk made a run to the track to unload his shuttle into a waiting coal car. The noise was deafening. Dad yelled into my ear, explaining what I was seeing. The miner was working a block, he said, sloughing off the coal until all that was left was a pillar. An engineer has to study the rock above those pillars. If weight becomes concentrated on one of them, it will explode. The last time that happened, it tore one of our shuttles to pieces. I looked at Mr. Kirk's shuttle as it returned and tried to imagine the power it would take to tear such a machine apart. I wondered what had happened to the driver of the shuttle and started to ask, but Dad interrupted my train of thought. "This is a real engineering work, Sonny," he yelled, sweeping his hand around the busy workplace. The foreman of the work party saw us and came over. The black face under the white foreman's helmet was my Uncle Robert, Mom's brother. "Homer, Sonny," he said, looking at me long and quizzically. "How's Elsie?" "Fine, Bob, fine," Dad said distractedly. "Does she know Sonny's down here?" "I wouldn't take him anywhere he's not safe," Dad said. "That's all that matters." "I wonder if his mom would agree with that," Uncle Robert replied amiably, cocking an eyebrow. "You just let me worry about Elsie," Dad said firmly. Dad and Uncle Robert started discussing business, and I wandered away, trying to get a better angle on watching the continuous miner and the shuttle go through their choreographed dance of mining coal. Uncle Robert came and got me. "That's not a good place to stand," he said. He carried a 3-foot wooden pole with him and used it to poke at the ceiling. A big jagged rock came loose and hit the floor with a heavy thump right where I had been standing. I jumped and whacked my helmet once more against the roof. How my neck hurt. Uncle Robert chuckled. "A man has to be thinking every second down here, Sonny." I positioned myself where Uncle Robert pointed under a roof bolt and kept watching until Dad led me back to the man trip. As we trundled back down the main line, I was thinking about all I'd seen. I couldn't wait to tell the boys, but then I thought, I can't do that. This was supposed to be a secret. I was worrying how I was going to get around that when Dad suddenly started to talk. "I love the mine," he said. "I love everything about it. I love getting up in the morning before sunrise and walking up the path to the tipple. I love seeing the shifts change, the men bunching up at the man hoist, ready to go to work." So obviously, Homer, that's why there's so much of a problem between him and his marriage, but the mine is just his love. And do make a note, too, that he did meet his mom's brother, Robert, in the mine, or saw him in the mine. I listened amazed, not that he was saying what he was saying, but that he would share such thoughts with me. I felt proud, grown up. Dad took off his helmet and rubbed his head, scratching around it where the sides of the helmet had pressed in his hair. When he started to talk again, I focused on every word, as if they were gold coins he was dropping into my hand, one by one. I would mark that quote, just because I think that's special. I mean, right now at this point, Sonny is just in awe of his dad. He's proud of him to see what all he knows, how smart he is, how much he loves what he does. I love going to the face. I go every day, even though I don't have to. That's when I see if my plan for the day is working. I see it all in my head days before. See the cut the continuous miners will take, the route of the loaders, the roof bolts going in, the places where the methane might build up, and where the foreman needs to check with his safety lamp. It's all there when I arrive, just as I saw it, and I get great satisfaction from that. I found that I was staring at him, the narrow beam of my lamp focused on his face like a spotlight on an actor. "Every day," he said, "I meet with Mr. Van Dyke and his engineers, even though I don't have a diploma. I know more than they do because I've been to the face." And now we are turning to page 202. "I've been to the face, and they haven't. I've ridden the man trip down the main line, got out, and walked back into the gob, and felt the air pressure on my face. I know the mine like I know a man. Can sense things about it that aren't right, even when everything on paper says it is. Every day there's something that needs to be done, because men will be hurt if it isn't done, or the coal the company's promised to load won't get loaded. Coal is the lifeblood of this country. If we fail, steel fails, and then the country fails. The beam from his helmet lamp shone in my eyes. There's no men in the world like mine are, Sonny. They're good, strong men. The best there is. I think no matter what you do with your life, no matter where you go or who you are, you will never know such good and strong men. You're my boy, he said, and then turned so his lamp shined down a side cut, the lamps of his men flashing back from the darkness as if they knew he were passing. I was born to lead men in the profession of mining coal. Maybe you were too. Now it's going to hit a touchy subject because we see how proud his dad is of him, but he's also very proud because now he's thinking he's lit a spark in Sonny, and Sonny's going to want to follow in his dad's footsteps. After the man trip got back to the bottom of the shaft, Dad led me to the lift. The cage was beneath us, the shaft a little deeper than the main level. He pushed a brass button and a bell rang, and the cage came up. Dad pushed the bell twice more, and we stepped aboard. A miner came out of the little cement blockhouse, and at Dad's nod pushed the bell 3 times. We started up at a good clip, about 100 feet up the shaft. The lift suddenly stopped. I looked around worriedly. The ragged cut rocks surrounding us seemed to close in. All I could see above was a tiny spark of sunlight. I noticed a detail I hadn't seen before, a set of steel steps. At my question, Dad said they went all the way from the top of the shaft to the bottom. There was a gap between the cage and the steps. To get on them would require taking a step over the oblivion of the deep hole beneath us. At that prospect, my heart sped up and my hands started to sweat. Don't fret, Dad said, perhaps sensing my unease. They're probably just greasing the hoist. We stood quietly for a long minute. So what do you think about the mine, Dad finally asked. I knew what he wanted me to say, and it was tempting to say it, but I also didn't want to lie to him. I considered my answer and settled on the kind of evasive response I'd used on my mother over the years. I learned a lot, I said, and left it at that. I couldn't fool Dad any better than I could Mom. The difference was he didn't see any humor in it, and the way she usually did. Oh my gosh. Y'all, this has been fun. I'm constantly recording, and my dog is constantly barking or doing something to interrupt what I'm trying to do. This is just so fun. So fun. Okay. Let me find it back. I couldn't fool Dad any better than I could Mom. The difference was he didn't see any humor in it the way she usually did. What I'm asking you is, do you want to be a mining engineer? He demanded. If you do, I'll pay your way through school. I carefully crafted my answer. I'd like to be an engineer, I told him. A mining engineer? He pressed. He had me. I had no choice but to tell him the truth. I want to go to work for Dr. Von Braun, Dad. He didn't hide his disappointment. You should talk to Ike Bykowski about those dang Germans running around loose, he muttered. Sir? For Christ's sake, don't you even know Ike's a Jew? Dad snapped. He'll tell you that Von Braun, German bastard's not worth hanging. The lift jerked, and once more we started up. I glumly watched the rock slide past. I'd really messed up this time. Dad was not only mad at me, I knew that I'd hurt him. And what had he meant about Dr. Von Braun and Mr. Bykowski? I blame myself for everything. I should have never agreed to go down in the mine. I knew what Dad was likely to be getting at, and I knew I wasn't going to agree to it. So why had I gone along with it? I was stupid sometimes, no doubt about it. So I would mark that Homer fesses up to his dad that he doesn't want to be a mining engineer, that he wants to work for Von Braun, and his dad reveals to him that Mr. Bykowski's a Jew. So now that's kind of a little foreshadowing. You're going to see later that Homer is going to talk to Mr. Bykowski. As we neared the surface, the cold, fresh air off the mountain blew down the shaft, giving me a shiver. The earth's surface slipped past, and there, standing at the gate, still in her church clothes, was my mother. A rock dust crew stood nearby, their eyes locked on her. They shifted their gaze to Dad and me. Mom stared at what I knew must be my grimy face. my cold mascaraed eyes, and my blackened coveralls. Then, to my utter astonishment, she burst into tears. So do mark that the mom sees them coming out of the mine on her way back from church, and now she's crying. The Rock Dust crew took a step backwards. Some of them took off their helmets, rubbing their heads and looking down at their feet as if embarrassed to be witnessing to her tears. Dad tried to shush her. "Stop it, Elsie, you're scaring the men," he said, while unlatching the lift gate. "Everything's fine, Mom," I said, my stomach bottoming out. We were about to have a family argument right here in front of God and everybody. I couldn't imagine anything more embarrassing. "He's thinking about being a mining engineer," Dad said doggedly. Mom's tears seemed to dry up instantly, as if they'd been sucked back inside her. "Over my dead body," a voice from deep inside her said. So I would mark that Mom said that when Dad mentioned this. Dad pushed me ahead. "Go take a shower," he said gruffly. He looked around at the men, still ducking their heads, but watching all the same. "This is none of your business." The Rock Dust crew moved off only a couple of feet. Let me get past these pictures. Moved off a couple of feet, and we're on page 205, so they could keep listening. I walked to the bathhouse, but stopped at the door. Even though I was so mortified I wanted to disappear, I wanted to hear, too. Mr. Dubonnet, wearing his miner's helmet with his street clothes, stepped outside and saw what was happening. He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, chuckling. I didn't know what he thought was so blamed funny. "What the devil's wrong with you, Elsie?" Dad hissed, reaching up to take her arm. She pulled back. "This mine has killed you, but it's not going to kill my boys." "You're talking nonsense." "Black spot about the size of a dime," Mom said, poking her index finger at his chest. "Here, on that right side," she poked him again hard. Dad huffed a near laugh, reached down for a handful of coal dust, and tossed it in the air. He took a deep breath of it. "I thrive on this stuff. It's like mother's milk to me." Mom watched the dust settle around him. Some of it blew in her face, sticking to her makeup, but she didn't flinch. She turned and marched inside the bathhouse where I had retreated, sending naked miners scrambling for towels. She grabbed me by my arm. "You can wash at home," she growled. As we came out, Mr. Dubonnet tipped his helmet to her, but all he got in return was a dirty look. The Rock Dust crew scattered before her. Only Dad stood his ground, his helmet in his hand. He watched us pass without comment, all the way down the path from the tipple. I could feel his eyes boring into the back of my head. So we leave kind of on a sad note. Here was a day that Sonny was all excited about visiting his dad in the mine, because that was just something just he and his dad could do, not something Jim had done. And then we're seeing the day is ruined once he reveals to his dad that he does not want to be a miner. So anyway, that is the end of chapter 11, Rocket Candy. And I'll see you next time for chapter 12.